Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special iteration of the Paul Buteux Memorial Lecture, co-hosted by the Center for Defense and Security Studies and part of the J.W. Dafoe Political Studies Student Conference here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. My name is David Zapotic. I am a Master of Arts candidate in the Department of Political Studies, as well as a co-organizer of the J.W. Dafoe PSSC. Tonight would not be possible without the generous contributions from our many sponsors. Dr. Paul Buteux is an integral part of the University of Manitoba community for over 45 years. As a professor of international relations, he was the leading Canadian scholar on nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Dr. Buteux is committed to academic excellence, education, and public debate on defense and security issues. He established the Center for Defense and Security Studies in 1992 and served as its first director. Through his efforts and initiative, the Center established the University of Manitoba as a leading voice on international, strategic, and Canadian defense issues. Dr. Buteux was a favorite among students because he was an outstanding teacher and mentor. Thanks to his commitment, many of his students have gone on to successful careers in academia, the private sector, and government. Additionally, Dr. Buteux created the annual Political Studies Students Conference, the longest standing conference of its kind in Canada. This year celebrating its 40th. His purpose was to provide valuable experience to students in organizing an international conference and exposing them to the leading national and international scholars and policymakers. I would now like to welcome Aisha Khan, CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, to the podium to introduce Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Bob Rae.
Good evening, bonsoir, bonjour. Welcome to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. For those of you who are like me and you find yourselves frequently or fairly often in front of a podium or a lectern or a mic of some kind, I was thinking about it, and there's a few unwritten rules. So even if you have a glass of water that you put on this little ledge behind the podium, you never reach for it or find the time to drink it. You should never actually do that thing that everyone tells you to do, which is to imagine this audience in their underwear. It is a terrible idea. Never do it. It's an unwritten thing there. But the other thing I was thinking about is that once behind the mic, it's okay to state some things that are absolutely obvious to your audience. And so with that, the hope and the faith on which the establishment of the UN and its instruments was founded is currently being questioned. And it is an absolute honor to be in this space with all of you this evening to talk about 80 years of the UN and to reflect with hope and optimism or alternative ways of thinking about what that means for us in these times. You know, as one of Canada's national museums, and it is just such a really such an honor that you've chosen to have this, the Paul Buteux lecture series here again at the museum. We try to create spaces where we can reflect and have dialogue and conversation, where we can think about issues before we inspire the action that comes from thinking about issues. And so not only is it part of our mandate, it is truly an honor to be gathered here with all of you. En tant que Musée national du Canada, nous travaillons à créer des espaces où ces questions peuvent être examinées par la réflexion et le dialogue. Et dans tout cela, nous nous efforçons d'être une source d'inspiration, un lieu à la fois physique et virtuel où les gens se rassemblent, un musée qui appartient à tout le monde au Canada. And so it's an absolute honor to be here in this gathering place. Thank you for the land acknowledgement. As we are gathered in this place, just take a moment before we embark on this conversation, which I know will inspire us. to remember that these are the sacred lands of the nations that have been mentioned, the Anishinaabe, the Ininawak, the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Oyate, Dene, Sulene, and this is the homeland of the Red River Métis. For thousands of years, people gathered on these lands at the meeting of the two rivers, and they gathered in trade and commerce and in rich culture. And the reason that I think about that as we start this conversation is it was the relationships that inspired those activities, that inspired that culture and that way of being, that way of knowing. And when we gather in this place, it is, I always talk about this, but it is really a time for us to think about the relationships that we need to have with each other, the interconnectedness that we have with each other, with the land, with water. Of course, our water in the museum comes from Shoal Lake, and there are 3 First Nations that have been caring for that water for thousands of years. So at a time where, I don't know, I kind of figure this crowd is following the news a little bit, many challenges, and I don't mean to be trite about it, but obviously the obvious: war, conflict, climate change, challenges on individual and collective rights, and veiled and unveiled threats to our democracies and our democratic institutions. It's more and more important that we think about the values that support the way in which we want to be as humans. And so as a place that is for human rights, not of human rights, but a museum for human rights, it is fitting that this conversation take place here. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration hangs on a massive banner that hangs over the Garden of Contemplation. If you've spent time in this museum, you see it, and it's also in our introductory gallery, What Are Human Rights? The Examining the Holocaust gallery is a cornerstone of the way in which we talk about human rights, the need to have entrenched in law our obligations and responsibilities to one another, and it is set on the journey that one takes through this museum so that we can also learn about the UN and about international law and about what we have entrenched in rights and law and freedoms. And then the question is always what we do to ensure that we live those rights. If you indulge me for a second, I just wanted to share with you as I was thinking about this, I saw the chairs set up for this gathering this evening, and it made me think about a couple of things that have happened this week that for me tie together the importance of this kind of conversation that the organizers have put together for this evening. So today is, of course, the National Day of Remembrance of the Quebec City Mosque shooting and action against Islamophobia. 2 days ago, we marked International Holocaust Remembrance Day, had a conversation about online anti-Semitism. Yesterday, in this space, there were songs of healing that were rendered with a community in Treaty 3 that had, for the first time, put to paper their stories of the survivors of residential schools, and they stood on this stage with generations of their children and grandchildren as these healing songs were rendered. And just a few hours ago, the survivors of the LGBT purge, which was one of the longest and most systematic workplace discrimination situations that we've ever had in Canada, and we're opening an exhibit tomorrow about the purge of members of the armed forces, the civil service, and the RCMP. And we stood with survivors in this room. And in all of those spaces, there was thought-provoking dialogue, questions, ideas. You had to open your mind, you had to think differently. You had to reflect on what you believe in, what are human rights to you, what are the things that we believe in, the values. And in every one of those moments, I was grateful that tonight we would do the same thing. We would think about the things that we know, we would learn about things that we don't know, and then we would go back and we would reflect on how that changes how we think about things. What wove through all of those is also the sense of justice, and a belief that if you have systems and structures to support justice, rule of law, and human rights, we can be better. At this time when those things are sometimes questioned, Let's use an opportunity like this to reflect, to discuss, to challenge, and to question each other, because when we do that respectfully, we never take for granted the systems that we have. And frankly, I don't think we ever can take for granted the systems that we have, because it's people who put them together and it's people who also take them apart. So then we can do some work and reflection of our own. I want to thank the organizers. Thank you for having this gathering here this evening. I am deeply honored to be in the presence of two honorable and very fantastic social justice advocates in our country and internationally. And I want to take, I have the true honor of introducing the Honorable Bob Rae, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations in New York. Welcome back to the museum. His passion for social justice, I think we all know it in this room. We brave the slushy, cold, whatever it is, Winnipeg evening weather to be here this evening. Former Premier of Ontario, former interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, member of Parliament, legal counsel on issues of education, governance, human rights. I could go on. I will go on. He's a fellow of the Forum of Federations, Massey College, and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He teaches at University of Toronto in the School of Public Policy and Governance, the Faculty of Law, Massey College, and Victoria University. He has shaped diplomacy in the realm of human rights advocacy. He is an author, he is a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a human that we can all learn from. It is really my honor, and please join me in welcoming the Honorable Bob Rae to the stage.
I notice there's not only water, there's Kleenex, so I'm either going to make myself cry or somebody else cry. Aisha, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's a great privilege to be here and a great pleasure to be here tonight in Winnipeg, a city with which I have a long connection, and I'm delighted to be able to come back. I've already had the chance to see many friends in the crowd, and it's great to be here. I was chatting with Lloyd just a couple of seconds ago and saying, having spent the day today talking and meeting with so many people in the city and in the province about what's going on, I'm always deeply struck and moved by the tremendous civic spirit that exists in this city. I don't think there's a match for it, certainly anywhere in North America. The quality of the engagement of people, the commitment that people have to the life of the city and the life of the province, and yes, the life of the world. And it is just a great pleasure to be back, and to be here in this magnificent hall is really quite wondrous. And I hope you will feel that this evening has been a worthwhile discussion, because the topic is not an easy one. It is one that has baffled philosophers for thousands of years. About 400 years ago, the French philosopher Pascal said in one of his famous aphorisms that justice without force is powerless, but power without justice is tyranny. And the tension in these concepts is the tension that exists in our lives today. The UN was born at the end of the Second World War, at a time in history when we had been through the bloodiest struggle that was known to people at that point. And the charter was negotiated in San Francisco, final draft in San Francisco, in the spring of 1945, before the war was completely over, and in particular before the dropping of the bombs, nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mention that because as the world was preparing for the end of the war, There were, of course, over a long period of time, intense discussions between the members of the alliance that ultimately was successful and triumphant about what form would this new organization take, because it had to avoid the errors that had been committed in the previous generation. This was not the first try. The first try came after 1919 and with the Treaty of Versailles. And the first try produced the League of Nations. And really the architect of the League of Nations, who was a former president of Princeton University, which is the university that Lloyd Axworthy attended and for which he received his doctoral degree, was Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson was, as Henry Kissinger described him in his famous book on diplomacy, was almost the archetypal figure of idealism, that the yin and yang of diplomacy that Kissinger describes is between realists and idealists. And I think it's fair to say that Kissinger, in the end, didn't have a lot of time for Woodrow Wilson and didn't believe that ideals were enough. And the irony of Versailles is that the architect of Versailles, of the treaty that gave birth to the League of Nations, led the country which ultimately was not able to join. And so the League was born with some hope, but nevertheless a sense that, well, wait a minute, the United States is not in, they're out. And so that sense of tension in the creation of global organizations has been with us for the entire 20th century and now for this part of the 21st. And it's a tension that has never gone away, and I say to you, it will never go away. And so when we look at the successes, the challenges, the hopes, the fears, the frustrations that go along with the two words, United Nations. And I'm always reminded of the joke that Mahatma Gandhi told when he was asked what did he think of Western civilization, and he says, it sounds like a good idea. And the same thing could be said of United Nations. It would be a good idea, but we're not united. But the problems that surround us are problems that require our unity and require our collective will to deal with. It's important to stress that when the UN was born, it came as a result of a process of debate and discussion, as I said. And really, the first articulation of the debate was the Atlantic Charter, which was presented to the world after Churchill and Roosevelt signed the document in 1941. And ultimately, other member states signed on to the Charter after the United States finally joined the war effort after Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941. And the Charter sets out certain key objectives: the rule of law, freer trade, self-determination of nations, and a sense that the human rights that had been expressed with such great force by Franklin Roosevelt in his famous For Freedom speech would in fact be articulated and contained in the Charter of the United Nations. But the actual document that was signed in San Francisco was different, because it was not only, the Charter is not only an expression of the aspirations that people have for human rights, for the rule of law, for statements about equality and justice, which are in the Charter. But the Charter also says all nations are equal and their sovereignty must be protected, and aggression is a crime against all of us. But it also says that while all nations are equal, some nations are more equal than others. And you may remember that, without any irony, that just 2 years before the Charter was signed, in which it deliberately created a structure in which 5 nations had a veto over the issues of peace and security in the world. George Orwell had written his famous book, Animal Farm, in which, as you will recall, first on the wall was the statement, all animals are equal, but then one evening, the words were changed and people woke up, the animals woke up, and they said, wait a minute, the sign has changed. It says, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that's what happened at the UN. So just as it was being born, just as it was being created, the deal that we were left with was a deal in which the big powers, the great powers, self-designated, would have a veto over the effective peace and security mission of the United Nations. Why was that? Well, quite simple. Because the big powers said, if you don't do this, we won't, this fish is not going to fly. And if you want it to fly, we insist on a veto. And Roosevelt and Harry Truman actually accomplished what Wilson had not been able to accomplish, and that is an organization which the United States agreed right away they would join, which the Soviet Union agreed it would join, in which the British Empire agreed, yes, we'll join, because they knew that on the critical issues of peace and security, they would continue to have a veto. But the problem that they didn't fully recognize, because the full impact of the Cold War had not yet been totally felt, what they didn't realize was that they would be using the veto against each other. And they would also be using the veto against everybody else. And the culmination and the complete, I think, description of how bad the veto is was the realization that on the night of February 22nd, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the government that was sitting in the chair of the Security Council to decide on what should be done was the Russian delegate, who insisted that he knew nothing about it, and that it was the Russians that would actually veto any effective action by the Security Council against the aggression which took place. So when we look at this experience, it's possible for us to say that in some important ways the UN has failed. But what exactly has it failed? Because when people say to me the UN has failed, I say, yeah, but it was not set up to do what it is you want it to do. Because if the UN had been set up with all of the aspirations in it, and with all of the collective will to actually enforce those aspirations, the big powers would not have joined it. So it was like a kind of bargain that we had to make to say, okay, you want a United Nations, you want a United Nations organization, you want to have universal human rights, you want to have declarations of equality, okay, but you can't have that and have a UN without a veto. It won't happen. So we've been wrestling with this conundrum. We can take some comfort from the fact that it's the same conundrum that Pascal set out. Just to remind you, justice without force is powerless. Yes, that's true. If justice does not have the means to be enforced, it's powerless. If we didn't know that traffic laws would, in some sense, be enforced, we would be much less likely to obey them. The strength of domestic law depends on the link between sovereignty, power, and justice. And that link is the knowledge that it will be enforced. But with international law, it's more difficult. It's more challenging, and it's more frustrating. And that's the real world that the United Nations is living in. It's not a perfect world. It's not a world only of speeches, although sometimes at the UN you kind of wonder if that's actually what it is. But it's not only a world of speeches, because when you do the marking of the UN, you have to say, well, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have the Genocide Convention. We have uneven enforcement, yes. Sometimes enforcement that doesn't even exist. And when the enforcement is attempted, it's challenged. But we do have a steady growth in the structure and architecture of human rights. We have seen a remarkable expansion of the concepts of human rights since 1945. Think of 2 or 3 that have marked our lifetimes as Canadians and as human beings. We now know that 2 of the great injustices that have been committed in our time, the treatment of people of diverse sexual identities and the treatment of Indigenous peoples, is something that we ourselves have come to recognize are unjust, that we have to embrace all of who we are and all of who we have been, come to terms with our own history and our own past, and recognize what it is we owe each other. We've done this as a country. Nowhere is this better demonstrated than in this hall and in this place. We've seen how our notion and understanding of human rights has broadened, has become culturally more accepting, has become more generous. And we like to congratulate ourselves as Canadians, but we're not unique in this regard. Many, many other countries around the world are going through this same process. And is it a fight? Yes. Is it a struggle? Yes. But are we further ahead today than we were in 1945? Without question. Think of a couple of other major breakthroughs. In 1945, the world was dominated by imperial countries who lived in a world which they dominated, in which colonies were oppressed. And the process of decolonization that has taken place since 1945 has been one of the most radical and remarkable events in human history. And it continues to take place. The first thing you recognize coming in as a new person into the hall of the United Nations is there are 193 countries. When we started, we were just over 50. And the countries are from all over. I mean, the whole of the globe is now in the UN. The globe, the entire representation of humanity is present in the United Nations. It's just a remarkable thing just to sit and listen and learn from what it is that is said as people describe who they are and the journey that they have been on. And that process of decolonization has taken place, and thanks, I may say so, to geniuses and political leaders like Nelson Mandela, has taken place with, yes, with conflict, yes, with loss of life, yes, with struggle, but sometimes with remarkable acts of generosity and remarkable acts of reconciliation that go well beyond what we thought was possible in 1945. So we live with this contradiction at the heart of the UN. It's full of these aspirations, it's full of these achievements, at the same time as it's full of its inabilities to fully come to grips with the life of the world. And its inability, fundamentally, to do what it says it should do, and to enforce what we know should be enforced. And this has led to the sense that people have that the UN has not succeeded, that the UN is not the organization people thought it was or think it still should be. But this is not a new sentiment. Let's think of a couple of examples. 1957, 56 is often thought of as the time when Canada came of age on the stage of the United Nations. Lester Pearson, who'd been elected earlier as the President of the General Assembly, now was in his seat as the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada, dealing with the invasion of the Suez Canal by an alliance of Israel, France, and the United Kingdom. It was a surprise attack. And Pearson led the way in saying, how do we get out of this? How do we get to a point where we can create peace where there was war? And how can we create the conditions that would allow this to happen? Well, the reason that it happened was because two great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, said to two other powers whose power was dwindling, the French and the British, no, you can't do this. This isn't going to work. You have to withdraw. And Mr. Pearson was able to see that moment where he could take advantage of the situation and move it forward. But let's also remember that that same period of time was the time when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary and wiped out a revolution that was based on the Charter, that was based on the principles of universal human rights, that was based on a desire to free the Hungarian people from the oppression of the Soviet Empire, which had been brought over them. UN couldn't lift a finger. UN couldn't do anything. Mr. Pearson couldn't do anything except for say, we'll take in Hungarians who are coming. We'll take them here in Canada. Why? Power politics. The Russians said, no, that's our sphere of influence. We have nuclear weapons. You can't move in. So this tension between where there is power being exercised and where it's being exercised in brutal ways, and how do we defend ourselves against the sheer brutality of power politics. How we do that effectively can sometimes be moments of frustration. It would take the Hungarian people another 24 years before they could see the freedom that they had fought for and died in 1956 and 57. And so it's so important for us to understand how difficult these challenges are. And now, where do we find ourselves? We're in the world in which this tension is still with us, in which, looking back, we can see how much we have achieved. The UN, when it started, there was no World Health Organization, there was no UNICEF, there was no UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees, there was no UN High Commission on Human Rights. The UN budget now it's about $10 billion if you look at what it is to run the organization plus peacekeeping, but it's another $65 billion. It's a total of $75 billion, which is now being used for development and for the Sustainable Development Goals and all of the elements that make up the life of the world, the life of the United Nations. That work goes on. But it only goes on if we're prepared to pay for it, and if we're prepared to commit ourselves to it, and if we're prepared to understand how delicate is the consensus that we thought we had reached with respect to the utility and the value of international institutions and of international law. And now, of course, I have to choose my words carefully because I still represent the Government of Canada. And I am also one who's aware that sometimes my comments extend well beyond my laneway. But the election of President Trump, I think, has woken us all up to the fact that the concepts of power politics, spheres of influence, dividing up the world, and economic force, and just the use of force in general, have not disappeared from the face of the earth. In fact, they face us very directly as Canadians. And we are, at this very moment as a country, having to come to terms with just how serious this view of life is and how much it flies in the face of everything we have struggled to build. We built a relationship with the United States that was supposed to be based on the rule of law and not the rule of force, and not simply the whim of one country or another, but was supposed to be based on rules which we both accepted because we recognized in our moments of rationality that it was in our mutual interest to do so. And that's the same basis upon which we have built all of the fragile structures that bring together the rule of law and bring together our ability to say we are responding to a difficult world with all of the reason that we can bring to bear to the situation. We have been able to say climate change is a fact. We've been able to say that coming to terms with climate change requires us to do truly heroic things in changing how we produce energy and how our industrial structures work around the world so we do not pollute ourselves to oblivion. That's what we've agreed to do. And then there are people who say, oh, it's not a real thing, doesn't really exist. We don't want to give our unilateral right to do whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want. And we have to understand how serious these challenges are. People who say there's no such thing as a pandemic, people who say we don't know how to deal with a pandemic, people who say vaccinations are bad, people who say the World Health Organization, withdraw from it, leave it, abandon it. No. Canada has made it very clear. We believe in treaties. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in reason. And we believe in the application of reason to resolve the challenges facing the human condition. That's what we believe. We don't believe in economic force. We don't believe in my way or the highway. We don't believe in spheres of influence. If we believed in spheres of influence, we would have said to Putin 5 years ago, go ahead, you want Ukraine, you can have it. And we've said, no, Ukraine is as entitled to be a sovereign country as Canada is entitled to be a sovereign country. And we say to both Mr. Putin, and yes, Donald Trump, we don't take your spheres of influence. We believe in a world where the rule of law means something and where the institutions we have built are worth saving and, yes, worth fighting for. It's a challenging time. I don't come before you tonight to say that the UN is a perfect organization or that the UN is the only way in which we can defend ourselves. No, it's not the only multilateral institution. NATO is a multilateral institution. Our treaties with the United States are multilateral institutions. We believe in all of these different agencies with which we can create certainty and better security in the world. But I do fundamentally believe that the dream that people have had, a dream now which is, well, literally centuries old, but certainly in our own time is at least over 100 years old, the dream that we can actually make the world a better place. How? By working together, by committing to working together, by committing to reaching out and learning how to live with every other nation and every other group of people in the world. And secondly, by building the institutions, the laws, the ways in which we can work more effectively together than if we just continue to say, might makes right, and let the mightiest take it all. That view of life is one we have rejected. And I hope we never see the day when a majority of Canadians say, yes, this is the way we should go. We have to continue to support the United Nations and the work that it does. And yes, we have the right to ask that the UN do better, that it improve. And those things are not contradictory. It can all come together if we persist in our political will to make it better. Thank you very much. It's good to be with you tonight. Appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Madeline Murad. I would like to thank the Ambassador Bob Ray for the wonderful speech that he gave. It's truly inspiring. And we're moving on to the next stage, which will be the Davos-style Q&A that will be led by the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy. But before that, I would like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Axworthy. a Canadian politician, and an academic who served 21 years in Parliament, most notably as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Both within and beyond the borders of Canada, Dr. Axworthy's contributions to human security are exemplary. Whether it's in signing of the Landmines Treaty in 1998, which led to his nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize, or setting the context for a Canadian leadership over a treaty that established the International Criminal Court. I think you'll agree with me that these contributions make both Canada and the world a better place by making sure that there's less harm and more good and security for the human life. Dr. Axworthy's achievements are many, but unfortunately I cannot fit them all in this speech, so I encourage you all to read his full bio on the QR codes that you have or on our website. It's our privilege to have Dr. Axworthy here with us. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Axworthy.
I'm not sure whether we're supposed to box or what we're supposed to do. We could dance. We could try. I think it works. Does it work?
Is it?
Is that working now?
Oh, it's already on. Great.
So let me just, in talking to Lloyd about this, let me just say that I think that in addition to Mr. Pearson's time in '56, the time when you were foreign minister, when the ICC was born, when the Landmine Treaty was signed, when R2P became an idea, the responsibility to protect civilians, and that remarkable period between 1990 and, dare I say it, the invasion of Iraq, when things went off the rails again, that would have been a great period of time to be foreign minister.
It was fun.
Yeah.
Well, it kept me off the street at nights, that's for sure. Bob, thank you very much for your tour de force about the United Nations, and not only the coherence of the argument, but I think the inspiration to realize that its history really is the basis for talking about its future, and that it's so important that as Canadians, we really become engaged in the challenge that you raised. Not easy to do. Our political system is not quite easily geared to that anymore. There's far too many distractions and disinformations, but if you don't mind, I'd like to share with you an anecdote, maybe with a group here. In 1957, I was a student at Sisler High School, and I was invited to join a Rotary-sponsored Model United Nations Assembly in 1957. Glad to say that they're still hosting them today. And the first country I was asked to represent was Israel. The next year, I had a second round, and I was asked to represent Yemen. Now, those of you who follow the patterns of politics know that there's a pretty wide gap between those two countries. What was interesting, my mentors, a wonderful couple of lawyers named Sam Breen and Helen Breen, tutored me on both sides of that. And so I learned a couple of things at the ripe old age of 17 or 18. Number one is that how important it is to have discussion and talk. And that's still something that the UN, for all its numerous reams of transcripts that it produces, it still is a place in which conversation, discussion, engagement can take place even within a reasonable system. I mean, I've attended Security Council meetings, I've attended General Assembly. It's not always peaceful, but there is a certain sense of decorum. And I think as an ambassador, I've seen you do the same thing, that you may not like that person, you may hate their policies of their government, but you realize that to get somewhere, you're going to have to negotiate. And I've always thought that was an accommodation as a young Canadian that kind of makes us a little bit special in the sense that this is something we've done in our own country. We've learned how to make deals, accommodate, and make things work. The other point I wanted to mention is just how important it was that an organization like the Rotary of Canada would undertake to sponsor cross-country model UN assemblies so young men and women just beginning to learn the ways of the world would have a place to feel that there was some rule, there was some inspiration, there was some place to go. And I'm not sure we get that same thing. That the Rotary is still using its model United Nations. But if you look at the other opportunities that we're offering to young men and women, my son teaches high school in rural Manitoba. His civics program is, he's told by his principal, he can't talk about Donald Trump. That's too wokey, I guess, maybe. He just can't do it. So I think one of the things that maybe in this room, I'm sure there's lots of educators, that the way in which we retain our commitment, our ability, our capacity to engage in this challenge that you raised is to ensure that we are properly doing our work at home, and that what the blessing I was given as a young student in North End, Winnipeg, to go to a Rotary model and all of a sudden, play at being an ambassador for 3 days, stuck with me. And I've, strangely, 30 or 40 years later, when I actually ended up going there, it was the achievement of a goal, of a dream. So, Bob, I guess maybe I want to ask a question I'm sure other people here would reflect, that with the challenges you've talked about, this new emergence of imperialism, a manifest destiny that might makes right, what do you see as being the ways in which Canada can contribute to that retention of multilateralism, and not just the retention of institutions, but the revival, renewal, re-energizing? Where do you see as the kind of things that we as Canadians should rally around in terms of our government, whomever it may be, goes back to work in the various parts of the United Nations?
Well, I think one of the things that I would say is that when Mr. Trudeau came to the UN for the first time as Prime Minister, he gave a speech which I don't think anybody expected him to make, where he spent a great part of his speech talking about Canada's Indigenous identity and our history, and the reason why it was important for us to embrace all of the aspects of that history, bad and good. And the reason that he did it was because he was trying to demonstrate to the members of the UN, most of whom are former colonies, most of whom have long histories of fighting oppression and fighting for their rights and fighting for their identity in the face of an imperial presence, to say, we're like you. We're part of your experience. And we understand what it is that brings you to this place. And I frankly think that what has happened and what is still happening with respect to our situation is that it puts us clearly on the side of those countries who say, we don't like being pushed around like this. And that's a big difference for Canada. That's a big leap of connection that we can have with other countries that are facing the same challenge. And that's very important, because one of the things that's risky about being in the UN as a country like we are is that you become immediately identified as part of a small elite of very wealthy, privileged countries that do not understand the real day-to-day challenges that are being faced by most of the countries and most of the people of the world. And I think that is an important step for us. The second one for us is to make a choice as a country, which I think we have to make, and that is that we will not go quietly into the night on this one, that we will fight, and we will join in the world's fight against oppression, wherever it comes from, or however it appears. And that, I mean, first of all, is aspirational. Yes, it's easy to say, fine, but it's also not easy to do, but it's essential that we do it. One of the things that disturbs me about some of our discussions as a country is that we become exclusively fixated on this question of the relationship with the United States, as if that were the only issue facing us. Because it's not. What's happening more broadly is equally important. What's happening with respect to climate change? What's happening with respect to our ability to fight the next pandemic? What's happening with respect to the 150 million people who are living displaced by conflict today? How are we able to relate to what's going on in other parts of the world? We can't lose sight of that. And there's a risk that we'll become so fixated on only one situation, that is to say our current challenge, that we fail to put it in the broader context of what's happening around the world, because this is part of the world's fight. It's not just Canada's fight.
Can I kind of riff off those comments?
Oh, riff, man, riff,
Okay.
riff. Not rough, riff.
I still have some tank left, gas in the tank.
You do have gas in the tank.
Yeah, I have some. But let me comment, and this is not sort of promotion, but when I was writing the book I was doing, I was intrigued by where do Indigenous people play a role in our international affairs. You know that in the sort of recruitment of the class of foreign service officers, it's 1 or 1.5%, far less than the population. And not only that, but the Indigenous people are not given leadership roles in things that you've just talked about. Climate change, water, what's happening in the North and the Arctic, where there's special knowledge and special sense of response and activity. We just have a new water agency established here in Winnipeg. But it's not given an international role. I mean, so all of a sudden, here's what I guess, and I think there's people in the room who could speak better to it than I can, is we are certainly not fully tapping into the opportunity that Indigenous Canadians have to make this country a smarter, better, more effective international player. And the reason is, in my view, is we've still not recognized our fundamental error of never recognizing them as a founding people in this country. And until we do that, till we correct that error, we're not going to be able to rise to the kind of challenges. But I'd be interested, because you've worked, before you were an ambassador, you did the things with the fire circle in Ontario and other issues. How do you think that one of the things to follow through on your assessment is we have to get Canadians engaged in how do we tap into and use and utilize so much more effectively the richness and the knowledge of Indigenous Canadians.
Well, I mean, I always try to look at is there anything in the glass at all? And then how do we fill it up? Fact is, we are now, I think, certainly, we're going to see, and we're going to have in Winnipeg in the next 6 weeks or so, we're going to have a meeting here in Winnipeg about Indigenous diplomacy. Where does that fit? How do we make it fit better? How do we expand it? We now have 300 employees who've self-identified in GAC as First Nations and Indigenous more broadly, Métis and Inuit. So that's happening. That's starting to happen more and more. We have a regular meeting among our team about what more we can do. We have the Indigenous Forum, which meets in New York every year, and which is for 10 days. We have a fulsome discussion around what's happening to Indigenous people around the world. And Canada's a leader in those discussions. We are absolutely front and center in talking about that and trying to make a point of linking up what their own experiences have been with how we go forward. I was, in fact, just chatting with Premier Canoe about this afternoon, saying it's important that we embrace this part of our identity and that we expand it on the global stage. And I think there's a great willingness to do that. It's interesting for me to notice that there's also resistance to that idea, some of it coming from developing countries who are reluctant to get into, allow that kind of discussion in their own countries, some of it from the most oppressive autocracies like Iran and China and Russia, which do not want those discussions to be taking place at the heart of the United Nations. So we are pushing that forward in, I think, a very positive way. So yeah, I mean, you can, yes, have we fallen short? Yeah, we fall short, but it's not as if we're not coming to grips with it, because I think we really are, and we're going to continue to do that. Now, I'm conscious of the time here, because I want to make sure that we allow people in the audience to come forward and ask questions. So will you and I have one more go? And then
I have one more go.
Good, go.
Because I want to take the second part of your second last comment about we want to stand up to the bullies and the imperialists and all the rest of it. And I want to read to you a comment from Lester Pearson, 75, well, close to a year ago. It says, Canada cannot occupy its rightful place in international society so long as its security is dependent on American benevolence. If we're to escape from permanent inferiority, our security must be found in an organization to which we ourselves contribute. So my question is, how are we going to contribute to that new challenge in terms of strengthening, buttressing, reinforcing, and in some ways changing the ways we deal with the issues of security, climate, discrimination? Go for it.
Well, I think part of it is, frankly, something that you've done. I mentioned it in my first comment, and that is, I think that the more we understand that human security is not just about the security of countries, it's about the securities of peoples.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Canada has stood for at the UN has been a reminder to everyone that the opening words of the preamble to the Charter are "we the peoples." Mm-hmm. It's not "we the states" or "we the nations," it's "we the peoples." And this is another really significant tension that weaves its way through the life of the United Nations. There are many, many member states of the UN who do not want the peoples to be represented. They want only governments to be there. And it's sort of like it's a kind of club of oppressors. And we sit around and say, okay, we won't talk about your problems if you don't talk about our problems. And we've really gone beyond that. But when we look at human security, we understand how, and this is what's, basic UN 101, there's a nexus between peace and security, human development, and human rights. And they all go together. The three of them go together. And one of the challenges, the real challenge of security we face in the world today, are those countries that are not able to provide support for their own people, that are not able to deal with basic conditions of security, and where human rights are regularly oppressed. One of them is in our continent, Haiti. Haiti is a classic example of a country where the state has not been able, on its own, to provide security for its people. And what R2P was about, I think, was a very extremely important concept. The question is, how do you make it happen? But you've got to keep trying to make it happen. And that is understanding that the governments have a fundamental responsibility to provide security for their people. That security is not only about police, it's also about jobs, and it's about work, and it's about rights, and it's about laws. And the countries around have an obligation to support that, and then the UN itself has a responsibility to do that. The challenge we've had over and over again at the UN is the reluctance on countries some countries to allow the Security Council to do its job. We still have not yet been able to get a proper peacekeeping mission into Haiti because the Russians and the Chinese won't let it happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's terrible. And we're now having to go around this as a country and say, well, how can we do this within the rule of law and with the will and support of the Haitian people? And so far, we've done some things, but still not all the things that need to be done. And that, I think, is where we can play an increasingly important role. And I think the more and this is partly perhaps a question of style, we should not be afraid to describe the challenges, and we should not be afraid to encourage a debate and a discussion about the challenges, as opposed to adopting language at the UN, which is just so mealy-mouthed, it's even worse than the House of Commons. And that's saying something. I mean, I really just said something there. Because the language of international diplomacy is a language where you deliberately obfuscate so that nobody will be offended.
Can I do a footnote on what you said? Because we talked about that period in the 90s when we had a pretty good run at things. Partly is that we had set up our own multilateral organization. With the Norwegians, we put together a human security network in the United Nations that was then able to become the promoter of the International Court and child protocols and things. So it's not just a matter of us being involved in a multilateral institutions. I think we have to look at our capacity once again to convene a multilateral new kind of institutional network to take on some of the problems that you identified. So with that, I turn it over to this very wonderful audience.
We have a chance for some questions. I'll look at our organizers to say how many. Do we have a moment here to ask some questions from the audience?
I'll offer my microphone.
There's
if
a
you like.
microphone around. We have mics roving around on their own. So put your hands up if you have a question. Don't hesitate. The one over here in the corner is on the side here, ma'am. Yes? Can you get a mic? Can we get a mic to this woman here? We need a roving mic up here quickly. There we go. It's coming up.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with you. We can make the world a better place by working together. I guess my question for you is, how do we access UN supports? My family law case is a huge human rights issue. Raim Aslam published a special report to the Human Rights Council regarding this situation in 2023. I have had problems accessing supports for this, even with our published reports. So I would appreciate any contacts, any supports that I can get to help myself and my children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's sometimes hard to deal with individual cases or with other situations, but I just would say it's not hard to get a hold of me. I'm I'm on social media. You can follow me at BobRay48 on what I still call Twitter, or you can reach our mission in New York or in Geneva, where the Human Rights Commission is working. It is possible to connect up with our offices and to see what we can do to help the UN respond to your situation. It's over here, ma'am.
Hi, I'm wondering what the role of the UN is in supporting a democracy, and can it in fact play a larger role in what seems to be a backsliding and severe problems in maintaining democracy internationally?
That's a great question. I think the UN has some challenges in this department because the members of the UN are not all democracies. And that's, sometimes people say, well, that means you shouldn't belong to the UN. You say, no, the purpose of the UN is to have everybody, good guys, bad guys, whoever they are, in the same organization. It's a place where everybody belongs. But at the same time, the UN actually does have, it's on the ground, its commitment to human rights, its commitment to the rule of law, its commitment to expanding those concepts and continuing to push forward on them and for them. And it does it in a whole variety of ways, many of which are not widely publicized or understood. But the fundamental challenge that we face inside the UN itself is that there are a number of countries. I mean, Lloyd talked about how there's possibility of creating groups of like-minded countries or groups of countries that are working together in favor of a certain idea or certain concepts. There are also countries that are joined together to do the opposite. There are countries that very self-consciously work together to support governments that don't want anybody looking behind the curtain at what they're really doing. And so it's part of the life of the UN that there are countries that do that and there are countries that do the opposite. And so we regularly have exchanges at the UN, for example, about China or about Iran, or before the end of the Assad regime, about Syria, about Russia's behavior in Ukraine, a number of ways in which we are very actively engaged. But just as the concepts of multilateralism and the rule of law are being challenged today in some of the most unlikely places, we need to understand that the concepts of democracy still need to be discussed and promoted. You can't export democracy as if it's a car, but you can certainly promote, and one of the best ways we can do that promotion is by what we do as a country, how we behave in situations. And I think that's one of the most effective ways for us to be promoting democratic institutions, by promoting our own democracy as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic for discussion, but I think that someone was in the political realm for 30 years. I have to say that we've got some serious dysfunctions going on, beginning with our electoral system. Our democracy does not fully represent the large diversity of Canadians. And the promise that Prime Minister Trudeau made when he first came in of electoral reform, I thought was really a marker. The fact we didn't do it, I think, has been a failure. And I'd like to see Canadians begin thinking seriously about how it is that, again, there's such underrepresentation of so many people, which leads to grievance, frustration, feeling that you can't trust government. The second part is, and I won't get, but you and I have discussed this in the past, and that is the breakdown of our political parties. I grew up in my particular religion, where the party was a place you brought people together to discuss, have ideas, argue. Now it's an election machine, and there's not much room for that kind of real engagement that needs to be done. It's just too top-heavy. And I think the third thing that we really have to do is and this is another topic, I guess we can suggest to the Human Rights Museum or the University of Manitoba, is the way in which this particular alliance that's occurring between massive wealth and massive access to digital platforms is really distorting democracy. And I read, some of you probably read the report about foreign interference in our election system. That has nothing to compare to what Elon Musk is doing right now in countries all around the world, in which we can expect, I mean, I'm not here to be Cassandra, but we can expect when we have an election that we're going to get the same kind of treatment of that kind of unholy alliance of the extremists and the Silicon Valley sort of supremists who really want to run the world. And boy, do they have the weaponry, because we've never seen anything like it before, and we've just seen how toxic it is in so many countries. And I think that's, to go back to the question, I think if the UN found a way, and you chair the Economic Social Council, it may be a place in which that discussion should be raised and where Canada could take a leadership.
We are going to do, that's, I think, a great point. I'm glad you mentioned it. I actually didn't mention much about ECOSOC tonight, but we are actually holding special meetings on two topics. One of them is on displacement around the world, and what is creating this displacement, this homelessness, people without a place to live, without a country and without a home, and how that has grown so dramatically and exponentially in the last 10, 15 years. It's way worse every year next to the next. And the second one is this issue of the relationship between technology and democracy, and in particular on how it links up to disinformation, propaganda, lies, and also the lack of access of many, many countries in the world to any kind of digital capability. And so we're seeing a digital divide growing in the world, in which a great many countries, only 36% of Africans have access to the internet. So we really got to, but at the same time as we're trying to expand that access to the internet, we've got to figure out a way of ensuring that the internet is not just a place of misinformation and lies, that it's also an opportunity for people to learn and get access to more intelligence. So those are two things that we're actually doing actively through our presidency of the ECOSOC to try to expand those discussions, which I think is important.
That's terrific. There's a hand way back. Do you see the hand back there?
There's several hands at the back. Maybe you can just stand up at the back. If you got your hand up, stand up back there. One of you, there you are, there you are, stand up, there you are. So we'll get you a mic.
Hey, thank you for taking my question. Specifically on Haiti, since it's right in our backyard,
Yes.
And obviously a pressing issue, what are some things that, in your mind, could be done to help with the situation, just generally or specifically? Thank you.
Well, we're trying, let me just say what we're trying to do, and I think we have to keep on trying harder. First of all, we have reached a conclusion that without dealing with the security issue, we're not going to be able to make any other kind of progress. That the security situation is so basically screwed up that you have gangs running loose over the country. You have people being killed. You have women being attacked and raped. You have people being kidnapped. And you have the gangs taking over effective control of 3/4 of the city of Port-au-Prince, which is where most of the people of Haiti live. So we cannot have a solution without increasing the capacity of the Haitian state to control the insecurity problem and to deal with it effectively. Now that's a big ticket item. That's a big thing for us to try to do. We have been one of the most significant, we are the most significant cash contributor to the trust fund, which is being used to support the overall security work of the Haitian police, as well as the work that's being done by the Kenyans and others from the region who are coming to support the work of the Haitian police. But it's got to be more than just that. It's got to be but it also all has to be done without taking over the government of Haiti. One of the reasons that everyone's been trying to figure out a way to do this right is because previous interventions have come in, solved the problem temporarily, and then left. And the institutions were not strengthened. And the failure to strengthen the institutions on a permanent basis is a failure that, frankly, we share with the Haitian political elite. Because we've not been able to solve that problem, which we have to solve. There has to be work done on development, and there has to be work done on human rights and the justice system, which is in such bad shape. So all these things require commitment. They require a willingness to spend money, but a willingness to also be engaged at the level of how we are supporting the police in terms of training and other steps that we have to take. We have reached a conclusion as a country that a UN peacekeeping mission is necessary, but it has to learn from the mistakes of previous missions which haven't worked. And we have to be prepared to stay the course in providing leadership to that mission. We do this now in the face where what the position of the Americans is going to be is not clear. It's not something on which President Trump has opined very much, on which other leaders have not said very much. So, we have to play our role. We think other countries in the region have to play their role as well. But we all have to understand that this is going to require much greater effort, which is another way of saying money and people, in order to address the problem. The last point is, the frustrating thing about it is nothing works without the Haitian people themselves, and giving them some sense of partnership from us, but also recognizing that it is going to be very, very difficult because of one last problem, and that is the problem of corruption. And I don't think we've been clear enough in the world or understanding enough about how criminal organizations have expanded, the scope of their work has expanded, the scope of their economic structure has expanded, and we need to understand that in Haiti, as well as in many other parts of the world, we're dealing with criminality on an unprecedented scale. And we all know that when that kind of criminality takes place and then is connected to the structures of a state, you then have a real problem. And that's the nature of some of the problems that we're facing in the world today, and some of them not that far away from us at the moment. And that's a real issue for us.
Could I just offer another anniversary celebration that has some bearing on this issue, and that's the 30th anniversary of the intervention that was taken in Kosovo to stop the extermination and the ethnic cleansing that was going on by Milosevic. And Canada, again, played a role, an active role, making probably the toughest decision I've ever had to be involved in, which is to authorize Canadian forces to become involved in an international sort of mission to protect people. The reason I raise it now is that it gave rise to what Bob has mentioned. It was the idea of responsibility to protect, which is that when a country can't protect its people or won't protect them or is the predator, the international community has a responsibility. It can be done in all kinds of different ways. It's those kinds of things that when you can put those things on the table and sort of start reusing them, so we don't have to invent the wheel. There's a lot of things that have happened at the United Nations and in the other multilateral organizations to show the benefit of doing it, but we have to start understanding our history a little bit better because we've forgotten all those things. And that's where I really think that I agree fully with the ambassador. The degree and level of abuse that's now taking place that goes unanswered. I mean, you mentioned Haiti. I have some context from old days of what's going on in Sudan, where two warlords who have no more, it's not ideology, it's not fighting for a cause, it's to fight for who gets the oil revenues, have murdered and killed over 1 million people and another 1 million starving. And the ability of the international community is saying, oh yeah, right, we better get our diplomats out of there. So that's where I think that there's a kind of, we've lost a little bit of our mojo on that, and that's where I think that maybe the fact that Trump is now taking such a wrecking ball is going to give Canadians a chance to rethink a little bit and reset our foreign policy back into an area, as Bob Wright described, that really meets at the coalface the problems that we really have. So I think for those who simply say we can't do anything, we're too small, there's too many people in pundits in the academic world who say, oh, it's all up to big powers. That's not true. Simply not true historically.
Sure, let's take in the middle here. Have we got some more there? Is there another one there? Yeah, go ahead. Yes,
Hi.
please.
So it's a little bit of a complicated question I'm going to ask you right now, so please bear with me. Your premise is based on the idea that, of the speech that you gave, is that the UN still stands as a symbol of global idealism, of where we as humanity want to go, essentially. But it's built on a false premise of inequality based on the veto system. And you're right, we have some really, really big problems to fix in this world. So should we still be putting a $75 billion budget into an organization that is based on such a false premise when we have problems that are going to take hundreds of years to fix in this world? Or should we be starting somewhere fresh?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think the resolution of some of our problems is going to take as long as you describe it. I think we've got, I mean, when it comes to climate change, for example, we really don't have a choice but to do what we're doing, which is to try to get emissions reduced and to try to assist those countries that are having a tremendous problem with the impact of climate change to be able to develop more resilience. And that's why we talk about climate finance, we talk about adaptation, and we talk about mitigation. But you tell me what's the other way to deal with climate change. If you say that's one of the great challenges we're facing, I think that's what it takes. It takes reducing emissions and getting to net zero, and it takes helping countries that have already been devastated by the impacts of climate change and will continue to become even more intensely affected by climate change. So that's one example where, look, where you put your money exactly, what UN project is it, or what particular initiatives at ground zero do you take on? That's an open question. Are we spending our money wisely here? Are we getting enough results for what we're doing? Are we achieving the Sustainable Development Goals this way more than we are in some other way? All that involves measurement of outcomes and assessment and accountability, which is sorely lacking in the UN and is desperately needed in terms of how we put our money and where we put it. So I would say there probably isn't that much of a division of opinion between you and me, except this. One is, I don't think we have a long, long time to start to turn the curve on some of these critical questions. I think it's quite urgent that we move on these. And the second one is that we should be much more steely-eyed ourselves as Canadians and working with others as well to try to figure out what actually works better than something else. When I talk about the UN's imperfections, I didn't have the chance tonight to get into all of the challenges. The UN is not a hugely efficient organization. It's a big bureaucracy in terms of how it operates. We need to do more in the field of development of humanitarian assistance to simply give people the money to be able to solve their own problems, rather than saying, oh, we've got a whole bunch of people who can solve your problems for you, which is not a good idea. It's very difficult when you have a large bureaucracy, because a lot of times people will say in a large bureaucracy, we need the money, we need this. And you say, but you only need it to do what you've already been doing, and that hasn't proven to be very effective. So let's find out what works better and put our money there. That requires much greater discipline and, frankly, much more tough-mindedness on the part of donors to figure out how does this work better. Donor countries all have to coordinate better what they're doing so we don't duplicate what everyone is doing, so that we work in a coordinated and much more effective way. There's many, many ways in which we need to be more efficient. And the challenge is now with this threatened cut of assistance from the United States to the global assistance system, we need to understand that this discussion is no longer a theoretical one. It's a very immediate one, because we're going to have less money in the global system. We're not going to have 65 billion. We're going to have maybe 50 or 45 or 40. And at that point, you have to say, well, now we really have to look hard at where we could spend the money more effectively and more efficiently. So it's a big agenda. I mean, there's a big number of things that we have to accomplish. But we really, when you think of how dramatically India and China have come out of poverty in the last 50 years, and how transformative their own investments have been, we need to understand and appreciate more that a lot of these changes are already happening. And it's not the development and humanitarian system that have changed China and changed India. It's their own ability to say, we want to become more prosperous, we want to become more successful, this is how we have to do it. So we do need to sort of have a frank discussion about some of these things going forward. But some aspect of the UN, the global system, the multilateral system, whatever name it's given, has to be part of some of those solutions, because we simply can't do it alone. It's sort of like there used to be smoking sections in restaurants. And there used to be even smoking sections in airplanes, if you can imagine such a stupid thing. But there were. Why? And you say, we can't afford a smoking section on planet Earth. We can't afford to think that, you know, the pollution from Manitoba just goes up to the little package of the atmosphere that's above Manitoba. And if we cut down our emissions, that will reduce climate change in Manitoba. That's not how it works. That's not the science. The science tells us this is a global problem. We need global solutions. And that's where we still got to go. I think we got a chance for a couple of questions. Do we?
I have the microphone. Sorry.
Okay, well, we'll let you go, and then Dr. Axworthy can close up. I think we're coming to the end of our time. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much.
We are. I'm getting nodding here. So one last question, and then Dr. Axworthy will answer that one.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I said, I have the microphone, so everybody should listen to me. Thank you. My name is Paul Kambaja. I am from Congo, RDC. And right now, my country is bleeding because we are under war. And for the last 30 years, UN has been in Congo, and yet 10 million people have been killed, and they are still dying. Over 7 million displaced, so many raped women and girls. My heart is just bleeding inside me. And we have a generation of UN kids. These are the kids unwanted by the UN soldiers after raping some of our women and mothers. My question is, why is it that Congolese people need to die for you to use your phone? We are dying because of our minerals, and we believe the UN only count the number of people dying and not helping the Congolese people. So that was my first question. My second is, how does Canada decide which country to help? Because we've seen an equal treatment, the amount of support and declaration Canada has made to Ukraine when Russia invaded Ukraine, which is the right things to do. And we, the Congolese people, have been waiting for the same treatment. I personally wrote to some of our politicians, and I've never received any response. So, do we need to look like Ukrainians for Canada to listen to us and help us in this world so that we can feel like we are also human beings like you guys? How much bleed or bleach do we need to use in our skin so that we can look more white to be considered as human beings? Thank you.
Well, I think those are really profound questions. Let me start with the second one. Is there an unevenness in the response of the West to different crises? And the answer to that is yes. Is that problematic for our present and future when it comes to the conflict in the Congo, for example? The answer is yes, it is. The question then becomes, well, why does that happen? And the answer is because public opinion in our country and public opinion in other countries is affected and impacted in a variety of ways by different kinds of conflicts around the world. And the point of the UN itself is that it's supposed to be a place where these things are evened out and where there's a recognition that no one, in the words of the UN famous mantra, no one should be left behind. But right now, when we look at the conflicts in Africa, we're leaving Africa behind, and it's wrong. There's no question about that. And so we have to respond to that more effectively, together with other countries. We have an obligation to respond to that more effectively. Some of the most eloquent speeches in the UN have been given by the ambassador of the DRC, saying, "Okay, you're responding to this crisis and that crisis. What are you going to do about our crisis?" And that was 2 years ago. And now we've seen that Africa has had a series of civil wars within Africa in which millions have died and in which tens of millions have been displaced. And the world has not responded to the same extent to that as we have to other crises which are around us. So yeah, there is a double standard there. That's not, I don't say that lightly or just brushing it off. I think it's very important for us to recognize it. And I'm glad that yours was the last question, because I think the question what it gives rise to is the realization that there's so much more to be done, and that there's so much more that is to be learned. But in a sense, that's also, I think, the reason why we need to keep going. It's not because, we don't keep going because we've solved everything or because we've found a better way to figure out where money should go or where our resources should go or how we're supposed to find a way to resolve these conflicts. We keep going because we have not yet succeeded. But we also know that one of the most important things we have to do in life is learn how to embrace our failures, not by pretending they're successes, but by saying, what do we learn from this? And what I learn every day at the UN, what I think everyone who sort of thinks about it can learn, is that we're the products of our past. We bring with us every day our own preconceptions and our own prejudices. But the reason why doing it in the UN and with the United Nations, with our fellow citizens around the world, is because it helps us to learn how to do it differently and how to do it better. And in embracing our failure, we also are embracing our commitment to change and our commitment to learning from the mistakes that we've made in the past. This does not give any great comfort to those who've died in the struggle and those who are dying tonight in the struggle in different parts of the world. But it is, I think, a reminder to all of us as to why the struggle is not only worthwhile, but is actually an essential part of what it means to be human in the world today. So thank you for your question.
Can I do the benediction? Because on that point, I'm going to take it down to its kind of basic, maybe even crass discussion. The reason why the choices are so difficult is that for the last decades, we have been substantially reducing, budget by budget, our investments in diplomacy, our investments in development assistance, our investments in promoting a variety of NGO civil activity. Why? Because the people in Haiti or in the Sudan, they don't have a constituency. They don't vote. And the calculation, I'm speaking someone who was in the system for a long time. And when it comes down to Treasury Board or finance, but I was also usually on the end, I always thought myself as being, the turkey at the Thanksgiving dinner every time the budget discussion came up, because you were going to be carved. We have an election coming up. As a group of Canadians who are clearly engaged and interested, to what degree are we going to start talking about questions that go beyond just axe the tax or some other sort of, those are important. But the reality is that part of our weakness has been a leaching of our diplomatic, defense, security, and human rights capacity, and that makes it very hard to make choices, so you end up sort of just going for the easiest out. So let me simply say by way of benediction, Ambassador Ray, thank you very much for leading this thoughtful conversation. But the thing I learned about doing a benediction is when I was growing up in a little United Church on Atlantic Avenue in the North End, is it meant things were coming to an end, and thank God for that. So let me thank the organizers and turn it over to them, because I think that Andrew, you and your team really deserve a great credit for bringing this crowd out.
Great to have everybody out here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heidi Marks, and I'm the Dean in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Manitoba. I've been given the enviable task of thanking our speakers, our interlocutors, and all of the people involved in making this wonderful event happen this evening. I know it's already been mentioned tonight, but I do want to emphasize why the Paul Buteux Lecture is such a special and important event for the University of Manitoba. The PSSC is the longest-standing student conference, 40 years this year, of its kind in Canada, and that is something to be very proud of. Holding this lecture, which is the first event of the conference in Paul Buteux's name, is a venerable way to honor his contributions to the discipline of political studies, our faculty, and the University of Manitoba. First, I want to express my heartfelt thanks to Ambassador Ray for his rich and engaging talk. I also want to thank Dr. Axworthy for leading the lively question and answer period and also for his contributions to the discussion. I learned a lot tonight myself. What I found particularly interesting and impactful was Ambassador Ray's emphasis on delivering a hopeful message in what often feels like rather dark times. It was helpful to be reminded that even in the context of navigating the complexities of international law and the imperfection of our human institutions, there is still reason, perhaps even more reason, to mark significant change and progress over time, and I also appreciated the honest appraisals this evening of the difficulties we face collectively in protecting the progress that we've made. So thank you for that message tonight. Many thanks to all of you who attended. We had more than 400 people register for this event, which is wonderful. I want to thank also the sponsors that were listed up on the screen. Dr. Andrea Sharon of the Department of Political Studies and the Center for Defense and Security Studies was the driving force behind this event tonight. So thank you so much, Andrea, for all your hard work. Helping her plan and administer the conference is a committee of highly dedicated and motivated students, many of whom you've seen and met this evening. These are students from the Political Studies Department, both undergraduate and graduate programs at the University of Manitoba. Many thanks to all of them as well. And I'm sure they'll remember this evening and their involvement in this event as a highlight of their degree. Thank you to all of the University of Manitoba and arts alumni who came out tonight. There are some alumni in attendance who graduated in the 1970s and others who graduated just last year. It's great to see so many different generations of former students coming back to connect with their alma mater in these meaningful ways. We hope tonight brought back some great memories for you. As a shining example of this kind of meaningful connection with alumni, I want to thank Tracy Bowman, Executive Director of Alumni Relations for the University of Manitoba, and Justice Brian Bowman, former Mayor of Winnipeg, for being with us tonight. They were both political studies majors in our department. Thank you also to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for hosting tonight's event. This is a beautiful space to gather in, but it's also a fitting space for us to be in as we think about the issues raised tonight by Ambassador Ray's presentation. And I want to thank the museum CEO, Aisha Khan, in particular for hosting us. She is also a Faculty of Arts alumni who graduated in 1994 with a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a minor in religion, which is my home department. And she then went on to law school and an impressive career. I'll let you go very soon, but I just want to encourage you to do two things. First, on your way out tonight, make sure that you check out the posters from 4 decades of conferences that are around the room here. And second, please consider attending some of the conference tomorrow. Again, this is the 40th anniversary of the Political Studies Students Conference. This will be held on the U of M Fort Garry campus starting at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Dr. Axworthy's keynote will be at 1 o'clock. Please see the pamphlet that was on your seat for all of the detailed information about the conference. Thank you again for being here tonight, and I wish you a lovely evening.